She came back to a ranch everyone said was already dead. The neighbors laughed. The soil was cracked and gray. The bank had written the land off years ago, and even her own family had stopped believing in it. Kael Rowan was 24 years old, broke, and standing in a field of dust with nothing but an old journal and a stubborn refusal to accept what everyone else called the truth. They told her to sell. They told her she was wasting her life. She bought 300 sheep instead. This is the story of what happened next, and I promise you, it is nothing like what anyone expected. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you've ever bet on something nobody else believed in, hit that like button, because this one is for you. The truck's left rear tire had been slowly losing air since Ridgeline Pass, and by the time Kael Rowan finally pulled off the crumbling county road and through the gap in the old wooden fence, the vehicle was listing hard to one side, dragging through weeds that had grown so tall they scraped against the undercarriage like fingers trying to hold her back. She cut the engine. For a long moment she just sat there, both hands still on the wheel, staring through the cracked windshield at the place she had spent most of her adult life trying to forget. The Rowan Ranch. 412 acres of high desert scrubland sitting at roughly 6,000 feet elevation in the Sable Creek Valley, tucked into the eastern shadow of the Crestfall Mountains in a part of the state where the winters came early and the summers burned everything they touched. The main house was a two-story structure built from local timber sometime in the 1940s, and it looked every single year of its age. The porch sagged. The paint, what was left of it, had bleached to the color of old bone. One of the second-floor shutters hung sideways from a single hinge, banging slow and irregular in the afternoon wind. Behind the house, the pastures spread out in uneven terraces down the hillside toward the dry creek bed. They were the color of ash. Whatever grass had grown there once had either died outright or retreated into thin, brittle patches that rattled in the breeze like paper. Kael got out of the truck. The air hit her immediately. That particular high desert smell of dust and sage, and something older underneath, something she couldn't name but recognized in her chest like a half-forgotten song. She stood there in her worn jeans and the faded green jacket she'd bought secondhand in Denver 3 years ago. Her dark hair pulled back in a knot that had been neat at 6 that morning and was now mostly a loose tangle. She was not a particularly tall woman, not particularly imposing in any way. She had the kind of face that people tended to underestimate, angular and serious, with eyes that were very dark brown and moved over things slowly, the way a person's eyes move when they're actually trying to understand something rather than just confirm what they already think. She was 24 years old. She had $4,100 in her checking account, a truck with a slow leak in the rear tire, and a duffel bag containing almost everything she owned. "Well," she said to nobody. "Here we go." Cut. The back door opened before she reached the porch, and her grandmother appeared in the frame, a small, sharp-shouldered woman in her mid-70s named Vera Rowan, who had the particular posture of someone who had spent decades refusing to let their spine make any concessions to age or difficulty. "You're late," Vera said. The pass was icy. It's September. It was still icy. Vera studied her for a moment with eyes that were the same dark brown as Kael's, then stepped back to let her in. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something faintly medicinal, and Kael noticed immediately that there were pill bottles arranged on the counter next to the stove in a careful line, each labeled in her grandmother's angular handwriting. She didn't mention them, not yet. "How bad is it?" Kael asked, setting her bag down. Vera filled 2 cups without being asked and brought them to the table. She sat down slowly, more slowly than Kael remembered, and wrapped both hands around her cup. The north pasture lost whatever grass was left in the drought 2 summers ago. The south field has some cover, but it's thin. Fence along the east boundary is down in 3 places. She paused. The well's been running low since spring. Kael pulled out the chair across from her and sat. The creek? Dry since July. Came back a little when it rained in August, but not enough to matter. What about the water rights? Vera looked at her. What about them? Grandfather registered water rights back in the 70s. Her grandmother was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather, she said finally, had a lot of ideas. I know he did. Most people around here would tell you they were impractical ideas. I know that too. Kale wrapped her hands around her cup the same way her grandmother had, mirroring the gesture without realizing it. That's not what I asked. The water rights? Are they still registered? Vera looked at her granddaughter for a long count. Then, yes. The journal was in this back bedroom on the second floor, in the bottom drawer of the old cedar chest that had sat in that room for as long as Kyle could remember. She'd known it was there since she was 12, had even snuck up to look at it a few times as a teenager, though back then the dense, cramped handwriting had seemed less like a document and more like evidence of her grandfather's general eccentricity. Edwin Rowan had been, by most accounts in the Sable Creek Valley, something of an oddball. He'd read constantly, not novels, but journals and surveys and technical reports, the kind of dry documents that showed up in university libraries. He'd corresponded for decades with soil scientists and hydrologists at the State Agricultural College, and he'd spent 30 years quietly, methodically documenting the land he owned: soil composition, drainage patterns, seasonal variations, the behavior of the water table during wet years versus dry years. Most of the valley had thought he was peculiar. A few of them had thought he was delusional. None of them had taken him seriously. He'd died 8 years ago, before he could prove anything. Kyle sat cross-legged on the old cedar chest with the journal open in her lap, reading slowly. The bedroom was cold. The heating system in the house was ancient and only functional in the most charitable sense, and she was still wearing her jacket. The afternoon light had gone orange and was throwing long rectangles across the floor through the west-facing window. The journal was not a diary. Edwin Rowan had not been a man who wrote about his feelings. It was more like a field notebook crossed with a technical report. Page after page of observations, measurements, hand-drawn diagrams, references to geological survey documents. He'd tracked the creek's behavior across 40 years of varying precipitation. He'd done crude soil permeability tests. He'd documented the way certain plants, specific plants, growing in specific places on the property, behaved differently from what the surrounding landscape would suggest, behaving as though they had access to moisture that shouldn't have been there. And then, toward the back, there was the section she'd been looking for. The surveys from 1952 and 1971 both indicate a significant subsurface water-bearing formation running roughly northeast-southwest beneath the eastern third of the property. The 1971 survey team dismissed it as economically unviable due to depth estimates. I believe those estimates were based on an incorrect geological assumption about the confining layer. Based on 30 years of surface observation, I believe the accessible zone is shallower than the 1971 team estimated, possibly by as much as 40 to 60 feet. The formation, if accurately mapped, would represent a substantial and relatively stable water supply independent of annual precipitation cycles. Below that, in slightly different ink, written at a different time, she guessed, I have written to Dr. Halloran at the university 3 times about this. He is polite but skeptical. I may be wrong. I don't think I am. Kale read that last line twice. I don't think I am. She sat in the cold room for a long time, listening to the wind work at the loose shutter on the other side of the wall. She started asking questions around town the next morning. Sable Creek was not a large town. The main street had a feed store, a diner, a post office, a farm supply co-op, and a bar that also served as the unofficial civic center for the valley. The surrounding valley was ranching country, had been for generations, and the people who worked it were generally the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who'd established it, which meant they had a particular kind of confidence in their understanding of the land. Not arrogance, exactly. More like the deep, settled certainty of people who had been doing something the same way for a very long time and had never had sufficient reason to question it. The first person she talked to was Dale Cutler, who ran the feed store and had known her grandfather. He was somewhere north of 60, with a square, weathered face and the kind of deliberate patience that either meant he was genuinely kind or was working hard at appearing so. "You're thinking about working the ranch," he said. There wasn't a question. "I'm thinking about it." He moved a stack of seed catalogs from one side of the counter to the other. "Kale," he said carefully, "that land's been struggling for 20 years. Your grandmother, good woman, tough woman, she's been keeping it from going under by the skin of her teeth. The soil's exhausted. The water situation's not going to get better. He paused. What's your plan? I'm still working it out. You thinking livestock? Possibly. He nodded slowly, in the way people nod when they're humoring something they've already decided against. What kind? Sheep. His face did something complicated. Sheep. That's what I said. Kyle. He leaned on the counter. This is cattle country, has been for 100 years. There's a reason for that. The terrain, the vegetation, the market infrastructure, everything's built around cattle. Sheep would be, he searched for the word, challenging. I know. That's a polite way of saying it, said a voice from behind her. She turned. There was a man standing near the door she hadn't heard come in. Somewhere in his mid-40s, lean and weathered, with the look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors and was not particularly impressed by people who hadn't. He had a bag of mineral supplement tucked under one arm. Tom Vassy, he said, not offering a handshake. I run the double V east of the highway. Your grandfather's place borders my north boundary. He looked her over without any particular attempt at subtlety. You're Edwin's granddaughter. I am. He was an interesting man, your grandfather. He said interesting the way people sometimes say it when they mean something else. He was. He had a lot of theories about that land. Vassy set his purchase on the counter. About water, mostly. He glanced at her sideways. You're not thinking of pursuing any of those, are you? I'm still figuring things out, she said. He nodded slowly. Good, he said, in a tone that suggested it wasn't really a compliment. Because that's rough country up there. It's been rough for 20 years. There's no underground miracle waiting to fix it. People have been over that ground. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. The smart play is probably to sell. Your grandmother would get a decent price, enough to set herself up comfortably somewhere. Some folks from out of state have been sniffing around the valley. I appreciate the advice, Kyle said. I'm not sure you do, Vassy said. Then he picked up his change from Dale and walked out. She found the sheep 3 days later through a notice pinned to the co-op bulletin board. Selling entire flock. Merino cross, 300 head, mixed age. Retiring, no heirs interested in continuing. Must sell his unit, price to move. The seller was an old rancher named Pete Aldis, who ran a small operation 40 miles north, up in the higher elevations. He'd been running merino crosses for 30 years and had built a decent wool clip, but his knees had given out and his sons had moved to Phoenix and Seattle, respectively, and he was done. Cale drove up to see him on a Thursday. The flock was in rougher condition than she'd hoped. The pastures were overgrazed, the animals were thin, and several of the older ewes had feet that hadn't been properly trimmed in too long. But they were alive, and they were merino crosses, which meant the wool quality was there underneath the neglect. She walked through them slowly, checking eyes and mouths and feet, asking Pete questions he answered with the careful honesty of a man who knew he was past pretending. They're not in their best shape, he admitted. I can see that. But they're good animals. There's a core of solid ewes in there, good breeding stock. I've got the records on all of them. What are you asking? He told her. She stood in the dust of his corrals for a long moment, doing math in her head. If she paid what he was asking, she would have roughly $400 left to her name. Not enough to cover the vet bills she was already imagining, not enough to fix the fence, not enough to cover feed through the winter if the pastures didn't produce. If this went wrong, it went very wrong. I'll need to pay you in 2 installments, she said. Half now, half in 90 days. Pete looked at her. He was 68 years old, and he had spent his whole life in this business, and he had the eyes of someone who could read a person. You're Edwin Rowan's granddaughter, he said finally. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment, then, he wrote me a letter once, years ago, about that land of his, about what he thought was under it. She said nothing, watching him. I thought he was probably wrong, Pete said. Most people did. He scratched the back of his neck. But most people haven't always been right about everything either. He looked at the flock, then at her. Half now, half in 90 days. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said. Get them healthy first. She drove back to the ranch with 300 sheep following in a rented trailer, the last of her money spent, her hands slightly unsteady on the wheel, Not from fear, exactly, but from the particular physical sensation of having just done something completely irreversible. She pulled through the gate as the sun was going down, painting the dead pastures in shades of amber that made them look almost beautiful for a moment. Vera was standing on the porch. "Well," her grandmother said, looking at the trailer. "I bought sheep," Kael said. Vera was silent for a long moment. "I can see that. I know what everyone thinks." "I imagine you do." Vera crossed her arms. She was quiet, watching the animals shift in the trailer. Then, finally, "Your grandfather would have thought you were crazy too." Kael looked at her. "But," Vera said, "he would have meant it as a compliment." She went back inside without another word, and Kyle stood alone in the fading light with 300 thin, tired sheep and $400, and her grandfather's voice somewhere in the back of her head, patient and precise and absolutely certain. "I don't think I am." The first night was chaos. The loading ramp stuck. 3 ewes got loose in the dark and had to be chased down across the south field with a flashlight that kept cutting out. One older animal had gone completely off her feet in the trailer, and Kael spent an hour in the cold with a headlamp and a tube of electrolyte gel, getting fluids into her before the animal finally steadied. By midnight, she was sitting on the cold ground in the corner of the south corral with her back against the fence post, exhausted and mud-covered, watching the flock settle into their first uneasy sleep on the Rowan Ranch. She pulled out her phone. No messages. She sat there in the dark and the quiet, listening to the sound of 300 animals breathing, the creak of the fence, the wind moving through the dead grass. She pulled out her grandfather's journal and held it without opening it. "The land is not exhausted," he had written in one of the early entries. "It is resting. There is a difference. Most people cannot tell which is which because they have stopped looking closely enough." She put it in her jacket pocket. She got up. She went to fix the ramp. The ramp got fixed at midnight, and by the time Kael finally got the last straggler into the south corral and latched the gate, the cold had settled into her joints in a way that felt personal. She walked back to the house with mud on her knees and hay in her hair and stood at the kitchen sink running hot water over her hands for a long time, watching the dirt swirl down the drain. Vera had left a plate on the stove, scrambled eggs and toast wrapped in foil, warm but not hot. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Kael ate standing up at the counter, too tired to sit, staring out the dark window toward the south corral where she could see nothing but the faint outline of the fence post and the occasional shift of a shape that was probably a sheep. She ate everything on the plate, rinsed it, and went to bed without unpacking her duffel bag. She slept for 5 hours, which was 3 fewer than she needed, and woke up at 5:15 when her phone alarm went off with the particular cruelty that phone alarms have when you're not ready for them. She lay there for exactly 30 seconds. Then she got up. The first 2 weeks were a kind of controlled survival. The flock had arrived undernourished and stressed from the move, and several animals needed immediate attention. The older ewe she'd spent an hour treating in the dark. Kyle had already started thinking of her as the old girl, though she hadn't said that out loud, turned out to have a mild case of foot rot that required daily treatment. 4 others had similar problems. The lambs from the previous spring were technically old enough to be weaned, but several of them were undersized, running behind in their development in ways that Pete Aldis's records had hinted at but hadn't fully captured. Kyle had no formal training in animal husbandry. She had read a lot. She had watched videos. She had called Pete twice in the first week with questions she was slightly embarrassed to ask, and he had answered them without making her feel stupid about it, which she was more grateful for than she let on. She developed a daily routine built around what the animals needed rather than what was convenient, which meant that her own schedule became a secondary consideration in a very immediate and unglamorous way. She was up before 5 every morning. She was outside by 5:30. By 7, she had done the first check of the flock, treated whatever feet needed treating, made sure the water troughs were functional, which they were not always because the plumbing on the property was old and unreliable and had strong opinions about cold mornings, and assessed the condition of the south pasture that the sheep were currently using. The south pasture was the least damaged of the fields on the property, but that was a low bar. The grass cover was thin and patchy, and even 300 sheep on reduced rations were going to eat through it faster than it could recover if she wasn't careful. She knew this from the journal. She knew it from the reading she'd done. She also just knew it from standing in the field and looking at it, which was sometimes the most reliable method. She started rotating them in the second week. The south pasture was divided into 3 rough sections by the old fence lines, and she began moving the flock between those sections every 4 or 5 days, never letting them stay in one spot long enough to strip it down to dirt. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't even particularly innovative. Rotational grazing had been understood and practiced for decades. But it was work, because moving a flock required physical presence and patience, and a working relationship with the animals that took time to develop. And because the fence lines were old, and several of the gates were unreliable in ways that expressed themselves at the worst possible moments. The first time she ran the rotation, she lost 8 sheep through a gap in the west fence line that she hadn't noticed, and spent 2.5 hours in the dark chasing them across the adjacent scrubland with a flashlight before she got them back. She fixed the fence the next morning. She fixed it again 3 days later when a different section gave way. She kept finding new problems. She kept fixing them. The land did not transform quickly. She had not expected it to. But she watched it. She had a habit she'd developed without quite naming it. Every evening before she lost the light, she would walk one section of the property, just looking. Not with any particular agenda, just looking. She'd learned it from the journal. In a way, Edwin Rowan had done the same thing, she could tell, because his observations were built from exactly that kind of accumulated slow attention. The way a particular plant came back in a certain corner of the field after rain, the way the soil in one area drained differently than the area 20 feet away, the way the sheep preferred certain spots to others, and what that preference might be telling her. Other people found this habit puzzling when they noticed it. Dale Cutler noticed it first, about 3 weeks in. He'd driven up to deliver a mineral supplement order she'd placed, and he'd found her standing in the middle of the north pasture at dusk, just standing there, hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the ground. "You okay?" he'd called from the truck. "Fine," she'd called back. He'd stood by his truck for a moment, watching her. "What are you looking at?" She'd thought about how to answer that. "I'm not sure yet," she'd said. He'd driven away looking uncertain. Tom Vassy had no such ambiguity in his reactions. He came by in the 4th week, unannounced, in the late morning, driving his dusty white pickup through the gap in the front fence and up to the main house without calling first. Kyle was in the south pasture when he arrived, and she saw him get out of his truck and look around with the unhurried confidence of a man who considered himself a relevant presence on any piece of land in the valley. She walked up to meet him. "Vassy," she said. "Kyle." He looked past her at the flock grazing in the south section. "Sheep are still alive." "They are. Thinner than ideal. They were thinner when I got them. They're gaining." He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement. He looked at the pastures, and she watched his face as he assessed the visible improvement in the south field, the grass coming back in the spots where she'd let it rest. Still patchy, but definitely denser than it had been. His expression didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes. "You're rotating them," he said. "Yes." "Every 4 days?" "About that." He was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be hard to maintain once the weather turns." "I know. Especially with a flock that size, on fencing like that." "I know that too." He looked at her directly. "What's your end game here, Kyle? Seriously. You can't sustain a sheep operation in this valley. There's no infrastructure. The wool market's been soft for years, and you've got water issues that aren't going to solve themselves no matter how carefully you graze." "I appreciate your concern," she said. "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed pleasantly. "It isn't." Something shifted in his jaw, a small tightening. He looked back at the sheep one more time. "Well," he said, "your grandfather had his own ideas about what this land could do too. I guess stubbornness runs in the family." He said it almost like a compliment, but not quite. "I'll take that," she said. He got back in his truck and drove out without saying goodbye, which didn't particularly bother her. October came, and with it the first hard frosts, which arrived at night and turned the pastures silver and killed the remaining wildflowers along the creek bed and made the mornings require 2 layers and sometimes 3. The flock had been on the ranch for 6 weeks by then, and the change in them was not dramatic, but it was real. They were filling out. Their coats were coming in with better density. The foot rot cases had resolved with consistent treatment. Even the old girl had steadied, moving through the pasture with a cautious competence that Kael had come to find oddly reassuring. The lambs were her project within the project. The undersized ones had required more individual attention, supplemental feed, careful monitoring, several late nights, but most of them had responded. Not all. She lost one in mid-October, a small ram lamb who had never quite caught up, and she'd found him in the corner of the east section one morning and stood there for a while with her hand on his flank, not doing anything in particular, just staying. She buried him along the fence line and didn't mention it to anyone. The wool was the thing she had not fully understood until she got into it. Pete Aldis had kept meticulous fiber records on the flock, micron counts, staple length, yield estimates. And what those records told her was that even in their diminished state, these were animals carrying genuinely good wool. Merino cross genetics produced fine fiber, the kind that sold at a premium to specialty mills and small batch textile operations, the kind that the commodity wool market, which paid next to nothing, wasn't the right market for. She had figured this out through research. She was now figuring out how to act on it. She'd started making calls in October, not to the commodity buyers who worked the valley, those calls would have been short and discouraging, but to specialty textile mills, to small fiber cooperatives, to a few online wool merchants who catered to hand spinners and artisan textile producers. Most of the calls went nowhere. A few went somewhere interesting. A woman named Renata Solis, who ran a small fiber arts cooperative in the northern part of the state, agreed to look at samples. Kyle boxed up small cuts of fleece from 10 of her best ewes and shipped them and waited. While she waited, she made herself useful in town. Not in any strategic way, she genuinely needed things from town, and she was there often enough that people saw her regularly. She got coffee at the diner. She stopped at Dale's feed store with enough frequency that the conversation between them had relaxed from its initial formality into something more casual, the kind of talk that happens between people who are becoming, if not friends, then something in that neighborhood. It was at the diner, in the third week of October, that she first heard about the land assessment. She was sitting in a booth with a cup of coffee, and Pete Aldis's wool records spread out in front of her when a man named Griffith sat down across from her without being invited. He was somewhere in his 50s, soft-spoken, wore his hair combed flat in a style that had probably been fashionable decades ago. He worked as an assessor for a land and property firm out of the county seat. Cale knew who he was without knowing him well. "Mind if I sit?" he said, already sitting. Apparently not. He put both hands flat on the table and gave her a look that had some apology in it, but not much. "I've been asked to pass something along," he said, informally. "By who?" "A group of interested parties." He paused. "There's been some discussion about the valley, about development. Some of the ranches that have been struggling, including yours, have come up in those conversations." He said it carefully, like a man reading from a prepared text in his head. The interested parties would be willing to make a fair offer on the Rowan property. Better than fair, actually, given the land's current assessed value. Cale looked at him. "Who are these interested parties?" "I'm not at liberty to say." "Then I'm not at liberty to be interested," she said. He shifted slightly. "Cale, I say this without any agenda. The land has challenges that aren't going to get easier. The water situation." "What do you know about the water situation?" "It's a dry region. Everyone knows." "What do the interested parties know about this specific property's water situation?" she said more precisely. He paused. Something moved behind his eyes. "I'm just passing along a conversation." "I appreciate that," she said. She folded Pete's records and slid them into her jacket. "Tell your interested parties that the property isn't for sale." He stood up slowly. "I hope you won't regret that." "I hope so too," she said, and went back to her coffee. She sat there after he left, staring at the tabletop, turning that conversation over. The timing of it bothered her. Why now? Why, specifically, after 6 weeks of visible improvement in the pastures, after she'd clearly committed to staying, why was someone interested now? She didn't have an answer, but she filed it away. Gosei, Renata Solis called in the first week of November. "I got your samples," she said. She had a direct, no-nonsense voice, the kind that made Kyle immediately comfortable. "I had 3 of my producers look at them. And they're good. Better than good. The micron count on 4 of your samples is competitive with what we're paying top dollar for from established suppliers. A pause. Where are these animals? Cale told her about the ranch, about the flock's condition when she'd acquired them, about the 6 weeks of recovery work, about Pete Aldous and his 30 years of careful breeding. The previous owner did good work, Renata said. He did. And you've only had them 2 months. About that. What's the flock size? Just under 300. I lost one. There was a silence that felt like arithmetic happening. I want to visit the operation, Renata said, before we talk numbers. Is that possible? Yes, Kyle said. I'm going to bring one of my fiber producers. She's going to want to see the animals themselves. That's fine. And Kyle, I want to be honest with you. We're a small cooperative. We can't take your whole clip. But if the quality holds, we can take a significant portion of it, and we can introduce you to other buyers who might take the rest. That's more than I expected, Kyle said truthfully. Don't get excited yet, Renata said. I need to see the animals. Kyle said she understood. She hung up and sat for a moment in the kitchen with the phone in her hand, then went outside and walked to the south pasture and stood looking at the flock for a while without saying anything. The grass in the rested sections had come in noticeably thicker in the past 3 weeks. Not transformed, she never thought in terms like that, which were too dramatic and too final to be useful. But genuinely denser, more cohesive, with better root structure, she thought, though she couldn't prove that yet. The sheep moved through it in the unhurried way animals move when they're comfortable enough not to be anxious about food. She'd stopped worrying about losing the operation. That had been her primary fear in the first weeks. That she'd made a catastrophic mistake, that the animals would keep declining, that the money would run out before anything improved, that she'd have to call Pete Aldous and tell him she'd made a mess of his life's work. That fear had been loud and persistent and physically uncomfortable. The kind of anxiety that sits in your sternum and wakes you up at 3 in the morning. It hadn't gone, but it had quieted. What was louder now was something harder to name, a focused kind of attention, a need to understand the land she was standing on in a way that felt less like ambition and more like obligation. She owed it that. After everything Edwin Rowan had observed and documented and been ignored about, she owed the land a fair witness. She went inside and took the journal off the shelf. She'd been through the early sections many times by now, but the geological observations in the back section, the ones about the subsurface water formation, she'd been reading more carefully lately, cross-referencing them with geological survey documents she'd ordered from the state library, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings after Vera had gone to bed, working through the dense technical language slowly and steadily, the way she'd learned to work through difficult things. Not fast, just without stopping. Her grandfather had been specific about locations. He'd described a particular spot in the eastern section of the property, near the old Dry Creek tributary, where a specific combination of rock exposure and plant behavior had first drawn his attention, as the most likely surface expression of the deeper water-bearing formation. He'd referenced a narrow ridge of exposed limestone that ran northeast to southwest, and described the way certain plants, specifically a variety of deep-rooted desert willow, had appeared along that ridge without any obvious surface water source to support them. She took the journal out to the eastern section the next afternoon, reading the descriptions as she walked, trying to match what he had written to what she could see. It took her almost 2 hours. The tributary was dry, as it had been since July, but the limestone ridge was there, lower and more weathered than she'd imagined from the description, but unmistakable once she knew to look for it. And along it, in a sparse, irregular line, were several desert willows. Not many, but they were there. She crouched down and put her hand on the ground next to the base of one. The soil was different here, slightly darker. Not moist. Nothing was moist in this dry autumn, but with a different texture. More clay content, she thought, or different mineral composition. The kind of difference that didn't mean anything obvious on its own, but that her grandfather had considered meaningful enough to write about over the course of 30 years. She stayed crouched there for a long time. "What are you doing?" She turned. Vera was standing 20 feet away, wrapped in a heavy coat, watching her. "Looking at the soil," Kyle said. "Out here?" "Yes." Vera came closer, slowly, and looked down at the ground where Kael's hand rested. He used to do that, she said. Stand out here and look at things. I know. People thought he was... Vera stopped. Well, you know what people thought. I do. He was convinced there was water under here, Vera said. She said it flatly, without inflection, as though she were reporting a fact about someone she'd observed rather than someone she'd been married to for 40 years. Absolutely certain of it. Drove him half to distraction that he couldn't prove it. She paused. He wrote to the university. 3 times, he said. 4, Kael said. The last letter was in 1998. It's in the journal. Vera looked at her. They were polite, Kael said. The professor he corresponded with. He just didn't believe it was worth pursuing. No, Vera said. Nobody believed it was worth pursuing. I know. Vera was quiet for a moment, looking out across the eastern section, her eyes moving in the slow, habitual way of someone who'd spent decades looking at a piece of land. What are you going to do about it? I'm not sure yet, Kael said. I need to save up some money first. How much? Kael had been researching drill costs for 2 weeks. She told her grandmother the number. Vera was very still. That's most of what you'd make in a season. I know. And if there's nothing there, I know, Kael said. Vera looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked back at the limestone ridge and the desert willows growing in their improbable, inexplicable line. He thought they were growing there because of the water, she said. The trees. They shouldn't be there otherwise, Kael said. There's nothing on the surface to explain them. Vera made a small sound, low and unclassifiable. Not agreement, exactly. Not dismissal, either. She turned and started walking back toward the house. Then she stopped without turning around. He was right about most things, she said. Your grandfather. Not everything, but most things. She paused. People just never wanted to hear it from him. She walked back to the house. Kael stayed in the eastern section until the light went, crouched near the limestone ridge with one hand on the ground, and her grandfather's journal in the other, and the desert willows standing quiet around her in the cold air, inexplicably alive. Renata Solis came the second week of November with a fiber producer named Jess, who was in her late 30s and who said almost nothing during the first hour of her visit, but touched everything: fleece, skin folds, the texture of the pasture grass, the condition of the water troughs, with focused, sure hands, the way specialists touch things when they're reading them rather than just feeling them. At the end of the first hour, while Kael and Renata were talking near the gate, Jess walked up and stood next to them without preamble. These animals have been stressed, she said. They were in rough shape when I got them, Kael said. Yeah, I can see that in the older coats. She looked at the flock. But the new growth is good. The fiber coming in since they've been here, that's better. Noticeably better. She looked at Kael. What changed? Feed quality, rotation, foot care? Kael paused. Less stress, I think. Overcrowded grazing is hard on them. Jess looked at her for a moment. You haven't been doing this long. 2 months. Where'd you learn the rotation schedule? Reading, observation, a journal my grandfather kept. Jess exchanged a look with Renata. Something passed between them that Kael couldn't quite read. Then Jess looked back at the flock and said simply, Okay, I'm interested. They sat at Vera's kitchen table for 2 hours that afternoon. The old woman had set out coffee and a plate of crackers without being asked, and had then retired to the back of the house with a silence that was either tactful or strategic, possibly both. Kael negotiated carefully, which meant she asked more questions than she answered, and she didn't accept the first number she was given. What she eventually agreed to was not a windfall. It was a modest, functional arrangement, a contract to provide a portion of the spring clip to Renata's cooperative at a price that, combined with what she could sell through other buyers Renata had mentioned, represented actual positive revenue, the kind that paid bills. Maybe not all of them, but more of them than zero. After they left, Kael sat at the table alone and did the math twice to make sure she hadn't misread it. She hadn't. She put the notebook down and looked out the window at the south pasture for a while. The flock was visible in the late afternoon light, moving slowly, eating steadily, their new fleeces growing in dense and fine and entirely invisible to the casual observer, value accumulating quietly in the cold. She went to find Vera. "The wool contract is real," she said. Vera was sitting in the back room in the old chair by the window, with a book in her lap and her reading glasses on. She looked up. "How much?" she said. Cale told her. Vera took off her reading glasses slowly, folded them, set them on the side table, looked out the window. A few seconds passed. "Enough for the winter?" she said. "With careful management, yes." Vera put her reading glasses back on and looked at her book again. "Good," she said. That was all. But the way she said it, the particular quietness of it, the deliberate return to the book, told Kyle everything she needed to know about what her grandmother had been carrying for the past several months. The fear she'd never named, the weight of it, finally, fractionally, setting down. Word got around. It always did. Dale Cutler mentioned the cooperative visit in a conversation at the co-op, and by the following Friday, it had moved through the usual channels of the valley with the particular speed of information that people haven't decided yet whether to take seriously. There was no single conversation, just a gradual, uneven shift in the way certain people spoke to her. Not warmth, exactly. More like a recalibration. The faint loosening that happens when something people were quietly certain about turns out to be less certain than they thought. She was at the feed store when she first noticed it. Dale had said something sideways, a comment about the wool market, about how specialty buyers were less affected by the commodity price drops. And the way he said it had a quality of reconsidering something, of offering information as much as receiving it. Tom Vassy said nothing. She saw him twice in November, once at the co-op and once on the road, and both times he looked at her with the particular attention of a man who is holding his own counsel very carefully. She didn't know what that meant. She filed it. What she didn't tell anyone was what she was thinking about at 5 in the morning before the flock needed her. What she was thinking about was the eastern section, the limestone ridge, the desert willows, the number she'd told Vera. The wool contract was real. The flock was improving. The pastures were coming back slowly and measurably, section by section, the way things come back when you stop fighting the land and start listening to it instead. But all of it, every bit of progress she'd made, rested on what was happening above the ground. Under the ground was a different story, one her grandfather had started writing 30 years ago and never finished. She was the only one left who thought it might have an ending. The winter came down hard in December, the way winters in the Crestfall elevation always did. Not gradually, not with any polite warning, but all at once. A week of sustained cold that dropped the temperature below 0 nights running and coated everything in a brittle, glittering ice that made the morning chores both slower and more dangerous. Kyle cracked her left knee on the frozen water trough on the 4th morning and limped for a week without telling anyone, wrapping it tight with an ace bandage under her jeans and adjusting her pace and not complaining, because complaining required energy she didn't have to spare. The flock came through it better than she'd feared. She'd spent November reinforcing the windbreaks along the north fence line and had converted the old hay storage barn into a partial shelter that could accommodate roughly half the flock at a time, rotating them in during the worst nights. It wasn't ideal. The barn had a roof that leaked in 2 places and a floor that turned to mud when wet animals stood on it long enough. And the first night she'd run the rotation, she'd gotten 4 sheep stuck in the mud near the east wall and spent 40 minutes in the dark with a shovel, swearing quietly and steadily under her breath, extracting them one by one. But they made it. The flock made it through December with no serious losses, and that fact, that bare, unglamorous fact, meant more to Kyle than almost anything that had happened since she'd come back. Vera had her first serious medical episode in January. It happened on a Tuesday morning, early. Kale was already outside when she heard the sound from the house. Not a crash, just a thud. The specific sound of something falling that shouldn't have. And she went inside at a run and found her grandmother sitting on the kitchen floor next to the counter, her hand pressed against the cabinet door, looking more annoyed than frightened. "I'm fine," Vera said immediately. "You're on the floor." "I'm aware of that." Kyle crouched beside her. Vera's color was off. Not dramatically wrong, but gray at the edges in a way that made something cold move through Kyle's chest. She helped her up slowly and got her to the chair at the kitchen table, and checked her over with the careful, unfrightened efficiency of someone who was frightened but understood that showing it would not help. "Have you eaten this morning?" Kael asked. "I was about to." "Before this happened?" Vera looked at her. "No." "When did you take your medication?" A pause. Vera's eyes moved away from her, which was answer enough. "Grandma." "I know," Vera said, short and irritable. "The bottles on the counter, I know, Kael." She wasn't taking them consistently. That was the discovery that January made unavoidable. The pill bottles on the counter had seemed, in the first months, like evidence of something being managed. They were not. They were evidence of something that needed managing, which was a different thing. The medication required food and timing and a regularity that Vera, who had been entirely self-sufficient for so long that dependence felt physically offensive to her, had been treating as suggestions. They had an argument about it. A real one. The first real argument they'd had since Kael came back, conducted at the kitchen table with coffee, going cold between them, and both of them saying things that were true but not kind, which is often how the necessary arguments go. It ended with Vera agreeing grudgingly and with considerable dignity intact to let Kael manage the medication schedule. It also ended with something unspoken between them, an acknowledgement, passed without words, that the situation in the house was changing in ways that had nothing to do with the ranch, or the sheep, or the money. Kael drove Vera to the county clinic twice in January and once in February. The doctor there, a pragmatic woman named Dr. Chen, who had been practicing in the valley for 15 years, and who had the particular manner of rural doctors, direct, unhurried, exactly as concerned as the situation warranted and no more, adjusted the medication and told Vera plainly that she needed to eat 3 times a day and take what she was prescribed. "I run a ranch," Vera told her. "You run a chair," Dr. Chen said. "Your granddaughter runs the ranch. Let her." Vera looked at Kael. Kael looked at the wall. "Fine," Vera said. The spring clip happened in April. Shearing was the kind of work that Kael had been dreading since October, not because she didn't understand it in theory, but because theory and practice in animal work were 2 different countries with a contentious border between them. She hired a shearer named Marcus, who traveled the region with a professional setup and had been shearing flocks in the valley for 20 years. He was compact and efficient and almost entirely silent while he worked, moving through the animals with a speed that seemed impossible until you watched his hands and understood that every motion was exactly where it needed to be and nothing was wasted. Kael worked alongside him for 2 days straight, catching animals, skirting fleeces, rolling and bagging wool with the focused attention of someone trying to learn a job by doing it rather than watching. Her shoulders were destroyed by the end of the first day. By the end of the second day, she was operating on a combination of ibuprofen and stubbornness. Marcus paused at the end of the second afternoon, rolling down his sleeves, and looked at the bags of skirted fleece stacked along the fence. "Good fiber," he said. He didn't say much, so when he said something, it counted. "Yeah," she said. "Your merino crosses. The younger ones especially. This is quality clip." He looked at her sideways. "You do right by these animals." "I'm trying." Trying isn't really the word for it. He loaded his equipment into his truck. "Most operations I work, the animals are a product. Yours walk different." He shrugged, as though he'd said more than he intended. "Anyway, good clip." She sent the first portion to Renata's cooperative the following week, and the second portion went to 2 other buyers she'd connected with through Renata's introductions. A small textile mill in the northern state that produced high-end yarn for the craft market, and a direct-to-consumer wool merchant who serviced independent hand spinners. The prices she received were not the prices of someone who had been doing this for years and had an established reputation. But they were real prices, specialty prices. And when she sat down with the numbers that April evening, she arrived at a figure that, after feed costs, vet bills, Marcus's shearing fee, the partial repayment she'd made to Pete Aldis in January, and the ongoing repair costs of a property that always needed something fixed, left her with a surplus. Not a large one, but a surplus. She sat with it for a while, that number. She wrote it at the top of a clean page in a notebook and looked at it. Then she turned to a fresh page and started writing down the cost of a well drill. She'd been building the financial case in her head since November, running and rerunning the numbers the way you run your tongue over a sore tooth, compulsively, without quite meaning to. The wool contract had changed the math, and the spring clip had changed it again. She was not wealthy. She was not even comfortable in any conventional sense, but she was no longer only surviving, and that difference, the small, specific distance between surviving and something else, was enough to make the question of the eastern section feel less abstract. She called 3 drilling companies in April. 2 of them had never worked at the elevation she described and weren't interested. The third was a company out of the county seat called Harmon Well Services, run by a man named Carl Harmon, who had been drilling in the region for 30 years, and who agreed to drive out and assess the site, which he did on a gray Thursday in late April. He was a large man, somewhere in his early 60s, with big hands, and the careful, methodical way of moving that you see sometimes in people who've spent decades working in environments where carelessness has real consequences. He walked the eastern section with Kael for an hour, listening more than talking. She showed him the limestone ridge. She showed him the desert willows. She gave him the geological survey documents Edwin Rowan had referenced, the 1952 and 1971 surveys, and watched his face as he read the relevant sections, which took longer than she expected. He was quiet for a while after he finished. "Your grandfather compiled these?" he said. "He compiled the analysis. The surveys are state documents. His interpretation, the bit about the confining layer estimate being wrong." "Yes." Carl folded the papers and looked out across the eastern section. His expression was difficult to read, the face of a man withholding his verdict. "He wasn't a geologist." "No, he was a rancher who read a lot and paid attention for 30 years. Carl nodded slowly. "The willow placement is interesting," he said. "I'll give it that." "What do you think?" He looked at her carefully. "I think there might be something here. I think the 1971 survey methodology was not what we'd consider state-of-the-art by current standards. And I think if your grandfather's confining layer estimate was even approximately right, there could be a formation shallower than what they estimated." He paused. "Could be. I want to be honest with you. This is not a guaranteed proposition. In this geology, at this elevation, you can drill and find nothing." "I know that." "You know the cost?" "Yes." "If you come up dry, that's your whole spring profit and then some." "I know." He looked at her for a moment with the assessing look of someone trying to decide if a person understands a risk or just thinks they do. "Why do you believe him?" he asked. "Your grandfather. He's been dead." "How long?" 8 years. 8 years? Nobody believed him when he was alive. Why do you? It was a real question, not a rhetorical one, and she gave it the real answer. "Because I've been watching this land since September," she said, "and almost everything he wrote about the surface behavior of this property matches what I've observed, the drainage patterns, the plant behavior, the way certain sections of pasture recover faster than others." She paused. "He was right about the things I can verify. I don't have a reason to think he was wrong about the thing I can't." Carl was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the limestone ridge, at the desert willows, at the dry ground that had been dry for as long as anyone in the valley could remember. "All right," he said, "I'll do the assessment drill. 1 borehole in the location your grandfather indicated at the depth he estimated for the top of the accessible zone. We'll see what we find." He looked at her. "If it's there, it'll be obvious. If it's not, I'll tell you straight. That's all I'm asking." He drove out. She walked back to the house in the late afternoon, through the eastern section, past the limestone ridge, past the desert willows that stood in their quiet, inexplicable line. She put her hand on the trunk of one. It was barely wrist thick, a modest, undramatic tree, and left it there for a moment. Then she went inside and told Vera. Vera listened without interrupting. When Kael finished, her grandmother set down her cup and looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. "When?" she said. "3rd week of May. That's the earliest he can schedule it. And if there's nothing there? Then we're in a difficult position financially. We can recover. It'll take time." Vera looked at her hands. The knuckles were swollen, the way they'd been getting worse over the winter, and Kyle noticed she was holding her cup differently now, adjusting for the joints. Your grandfather used to say, Vera started. She stopped. Started again. He used to say that the land tells you what it needs if you pay attention long enough. Most people stop paying attention. She looked at Kyle. He paid attention for 30 years. Nobody listened. I'm listening, Kyle said. Vera nodded once. That was all. Word got out before the drill rig arrived. In a valley this size, with this many people paying this much attention to the Rowan Ranch, it was probably inevitable. What surprised Kyle was the speed of it. Within a week of Carl Harmon's assessment visit, she was getting looks at the feed store that were different from the usual looks. Not hostile. Something more complicated. The look people get when they're trying to decide whether something is foolish or brave and haven't landed yet. Tom Vassy came by 3 days before the scheduled drill. He didn't call first, which was his habit, and Kyle was in the north pasture when he arrived, moving the flock to the rested section. She saw his white truck come through the gate and watched him wait by the fence until she'd finished the rotation and latched the gate and walked up to meet him. He had his hat in his hands, which was different. He usually kept it on. Heard you're drilling, he said. That's right. Eastern section. Near the limestone ridge, yes. He looked in that direction, even though you couldn't see the eastern section from where they were standing. I've run cattle across land that borders your eastern section for 12 years, he said. There's nothing under there. My grandfather thought there was. Your grandfather, he said, and stopped. He turned his hat in his hands once, slowly. Edwin was a careful man, I'll say that. I didn't always agree with his thinking, but he was careful. He paused. This kind of gamble, though, if it doesn't come in, I know the risk, Vassy. Do you? He looked at her directly. Because the money you're spending, I know what drill work costs at that depth. I know what your spring clip probably made you. This wipes that out, and then some if you come up dry. I'm aware. He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon wind moved through the pasture grass around them, the good thick grass that had been dead stubble 8 months ago, and she saw his eyes move to it briefly, registered it without commenting on it. Why? He said. Why now? Why not wait another season, build more capital, make it less of a gamble? The honest answer was complicated. She tried to give it anyway. Because I've been watching the eastern section since September, she said, and everything I see lines up with what my grandfather wrote. The willows aren't there by accident. Something's feeding them. She looked at him. I could wait another year, but I'd spend that year knowing I was waiting because I was scared rather than because the evidence told me to wait. And I don't think those two things are the same. Vassy looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was processing something he hadn't expected. You really believe he was right, he said. Not a challenge, just the plain fact of his surprise. I believe the evidence he gathered supports the possibility, she said. Which is enough. He put his hat back on, looked at the eastern section again, looked at the pastures, looked at her. Well, he said finally, I hope you're right. It came out flat and unreadable, the kind of sentence that could mean almost anything. He got in his truck and left. Dale Cutler called that evening. I heard you're drilling the east section, he said. News travels fast. It's a small valley. A pause. I'm not going to tell you not to do it. That's your business. But I want you to know, if it doesn't come in, if you need to restructure or bridge something for a season, come talk to me before you do anything drastic. She held the phone for a moment. Dale, I knew your grandfather, he said, and I know what he believed about that land. I didn't take him seriously when he was alive, and I'll admit that. His voice was careful, carrying something that might have been guilt or might have been something more practical. Just come talk to me first, that's all. All right, she said. Thank you. She hung up and sat in the kitchen, the house quiet around her, Vera already in bed. The evening outside was dark and cold and completely still. She opened the journal and read the eastern section entry one more time, not because she needed to, she had it close to memorized by now, but because she needed the particular quality of his certainty, the plain, undramatic confidence of, I don't think I am, which was not arrogance, but something quieter and more durable than arrogance. She needed to borrow it for the next 3 weeks. She closed the journal, she went to bed. She did not sleep well. That was fine. She got up anyway. But Carl Harmon arrived on a Wednesday morning in the third week of May with a drill rig that took 2 hours to position correctly on the uneven ground of the eastern section. He had 2 crew members with him, younger men who worked without conversation, which suited the mood of the morning. Cale stood near the limestone ridge and watched the setup and kept out of the way, which was harder than it looked because the thing she most wanted to do was be useful, and there was nothing useful for her to do. Vera had come out to watch, which surprised her. Her grandmother stood near the fence at the edge of the eastern section, wrapped in her heavy coat, even though May had brought some warmth back, watching the rig with an expression that gave nothing away. The drilling started at 9:17 in the morning. It was not dramatic at first. Drill work rarely is from the outside. It's loud and mechanical and proceeds at a pace that has nothing to do with the emotional weight of what's happening. The bit went down through the surface layers. Carl called depths to one of his crew members, who wrote them in a clipboard log. Kael watched the ground. She watched Carl's face. His face told her nothing. At 11:40, he held up a hand. The rig cut to idle. In the sudden quiet, the sound of the wind in the grass was almost startling. "Come here," Carl said. She crossed to him. He was looking at the drill casing, at the material coming up out of the hole, and she looked at it too. A different material than what had been coming up before. Darker, finer, clay-heavy. "We're at the confining layer," Carl said. His voice was neutral, professional, giving nothing away. "Your grandfather estimated the accessible zone starting 40 to 60 feet below where the 71 survey put it." He looked at her. "We're at roughly that range." "What does that mean?" "It means we keep going," he said. The rig went back to full speed. At 12:53, Carl held up his hand again. This time, before the rig even fully idled, the sound changed. A pressure differential, something changing in the pipe, and then a movement in the casing that was unmistakable to Carl and his crew, even if Kyle couldn't read it yet. Carl looked at her. "Step back," he said. She stepped back. What came up out of the eastern section of the Rowan Ranch was not the geyser of movies and television. It was not dramatic in that particular cinematic way. What it was water, real water, pressurized and cold and dark, with the mineral content of deep rock forcing up through the casing in a strong, sustained column that hit the ground with a sound that made something in Kael's chest go completely still. Carl let it run for 3 minutes, watching the pressure and the flow with the focused attention of a man counting. Then he got his gauge on it. He looked at the numbers. He looked at them again. He wrote them down. Then he looked at Kael. "That," he said carefully, "is a significant aquifer." She didn't say anything. "I'm not talking about a domestic well," he said. "I'm talking about a water-bearing formation with yield that will support substantial agricultural use. Sustained." He looked down at his gauge. "Your grandfather, the depth estimate was off by about 22 feet shallower than his lower estimate, which means he was more right than he thought he was." She was looking at the water running across the dry ground of the eastern section, spreading out across the cracked gray soil, soaking in, moving. "How large?" she said. Her voice came out steady, which was not how she felt. "I need to do more assessment, but based on the pressure and the yield..." He paused. He was a conservative man, Carl Harmon, not given to overpromising. "I think this formation extends across a significant portion of your eastern acreage, possibly beyond your property boundary, into the deeper geology." He looked at her. "This is not a small find, Kael." Vera had come across from the fence line without Kael noticing. She was standing 3 feet away, looking at the water running across the ground where the land had been dry for as long as she'd lived on it. Her face was very still, and Kael could not read what was in it, grief and relief, and something that had no clean name. The complicated thing that happens when someone you love turns out to have been right about something that mattered, only too late for them to know it. Vera didn't cry. She wasn't that kind of woman. But she reached out and took Kael's arm, just gripped it once, briefly, at the elbow, the way you grip something when you need to steady yourself without admitting you need steadying, and then let go. "He knew," she said, very quietly, to no one in particular. "He knew," Kael said. "Icha." The calls started that afternoon. She hadn't told anyone except Dale Cutler what was happening, but in a valley this size, 3 men working a drill rig are visible from the road, and by early afternoon there were 2 trucks parked on the county road at the property boundary, their occupants watching from a distance. By evening, her phone had 6 missed calls, 2 from people she knew, 4 from numbers she didn't recognize. She let them all go to voicemail. Dale Cutler drove out himself at 4 in the afternoon, which was the kind of thing Dale did. He was not a man who communicated through intermediaries when he could communicate in person. He pulled up to the gate and got out and looked at the waterline visible in the eastern section, the dark stain spreading across the ground, already drawing birds to it. He stood there for a while. "Well," he said. "Yeah," Cale said. "That's a real flow." "Carl says it's significant. He's coming back next week for the full assessment." Dale was quiet. He had the look of a man recalculating something large. "Edwin told me once," he said slowly, "that there was water under that east section. This was maybe 15 years ago. We were at the bar. He showed me some of his notes." Dale shook his head, a small motion. "I told him he was probably reading too much into the survey data." He looked at the water. "I told him the county extension office had basically written off the valley's groundwater potential." "I know," she said. "I was wrong," he said. He said it cleanly, without performance, the simple fact of it. "People were working with what they knew," she said. "Edwin was working with more than what we knew," Dale said. "That's the point." He looked at her. "That's always been the point." He drove back out. She stood at the gate of the eastern section and watched the water move, slow and dark and completely real, across the ground her grandfather had spent 30 years trying to understand. The desert willows stood in their uneven line along the limestone ridge, unchanged, unbothered, exactly where they had always been, growing, all along, above exactly what he said they were growing above. She pulled out her phone and called Pete Aldous. He answered on the second ring. She told him what had happened, not elaborating more than the facts required. There was a long silence on the other end. "I'll be damned," Pete said. "Yes," she said. "Your grandfather's journal." "Yes." Another silence. "Kyle," Pete said, "what are you going to do now?" She looked out across the eastern section, at the water running across ground that the valley had written off, at the flock visible in the south pasture beyond, at the house where her grandmother was inside reading with her medication on the table beside her. Everything still imperfect, still fragile, still held together with careful management and early mornings, and the particular stubbornness of people who refuse to let the obvious conclusion be the final one. "I'm going to call Carl back tomorrow," she said. "Get the full assessment done. Then I'm going to figure out irrigation." She paused. "One thing at a time." "That's right," Pete said. "That's exactly right." She hung up. The sun went down over the Crestfall Mountains, pulling the color out of the sky in long gradients of orange and gray, and the water in the eastern section caught the last of it and held it briefly, dark and bright at the same time, the way things are when they've been hidden long enough and finally, stubbornly, find their way to the surface. Carl Harmon came back the following Tuesday with a hydrogeologist named Dr. Patricia Wen, who worked as a consultant out of the state university and who had the particular quality of very intelligent people who have spent their careers being more right than the people around them. Not arrogant about it, just settled, the way someone is settled when they've stopped needing external confirmation of what they already know. She was in her late 50s, wore practical clothes, and walked the eastern section with Carl for 3 hours, taking measurements and samples and writing in a notebook that she kept tucked against her chest in a way that suggested long habit. Kyle walked with them and answered questions and otherwise stayed out of the way. At the end of the 3 hours, Patricia Wen sat down at Vera's kitchen table and spread her notes out and told Kyle what she'd found in the plain, direct language of someone who considers clarity a professional obligation. The aquifer was real, and it was large. The formation extended across the eastern third of the Rowan property, and based on the geological indicators, almost certainly continued northeast beneath the adjacent landscape. The yield at the current borehole was sufficient to support full irrigation of the accessible pasture acreage on the ranch. Not just supplemental watering, but genuine, season-extending, drought-resistant irrigation that would fundamentally change what the land could produce. The water quality was excellent. Deep aquifer water, mineral-rich, no surface contamination, No treatment needed for agricultural use. Your grandfather's subsurface formation hypothesis, Patricia said, looking at the journal pages Kyle had spread in front of her, was essentially correct. His confining layer estimate was off by about 20 feet in the optimistic direction, which means the water was even more accessible than he thought, not less. She looked up. He got there through surface observation and historical survey analysis, without any drilling data, without any professional geological consultation. She paused. That's genuinely impressive work. He was a careful observer, Kyle said. He was more than that. He understood what he was looking at. Patricia tapped the journal pages. May I ask, did he ever submit this analysis formally to the university or the state water authority? He wrote to the university 4 times. The responses were polite but dismissive. Patricia looked at the journal for a moment. Something moved across her face. A brief, involuntary expression that was hard to name. Regret, maybe. The specific regret of a scientist confronting a case where the institutional process had failed at its actual job. Well, she said quietly, he was right and they were wrong. That happens more than it should. She finished her report 3 days later and filed it with the State Water Authority as part of the formal aquifer documentation process. What that report established, in the dry, precise language of hydrogeological assessment, was that the Rowan property sat above a significant and previously uncharacterized water-bearing formation. A discovery, in the technical sense. A resource that changed the assessed value of the land so substantially that when Kyle called the county assessor's office 2 weeks later to ask a preliminary question, the woman on the phone had to put her on hold twice before she came back with a figure that made Kyle sit down. She had bought into a property everyone in the valley had valued at near nothing. What she was sitting on now was an entirely different calculation. She did not celebrate. That was the first thing people noticed in the weeks after the aquifer assessment became official. The people who had been watching the Rowan Ranch with varying mixtures of skepticism and muted concern expected something. A visible change in Kyle's demeanor, some expression of vindication, the natural human response to being proved right after months of being dismissed. What they got instead was more or less the same thing they'd been seeing since September. A 24-year-old woman in worn jeans and a faded jacket, driving her truck with the slow rear tire, going about her business. The irrigation infrastructure came first, because without it, the aquifer was potential rather than productivity. Carl Harmon came back in June with a crew to install the pump system and the primary distribution lines, and Kyle spent 3 weeks working alongside them. Not because it was her job, but because she needed to understand how the system worked at the mechanical level, not just the conceptual one. She got a crash course in pump pressures and flow rates and pipe sizing that was unglamorous and completely necessary, and by the time the crew left, she could troubleshoot the basic system herself, which was going to matter when something broke at 6 in the morning, which it inevitably would. The first time she ran full irrigation on the east pasture was a Thursday morning in late June. She stood at the edge of the field and watched the water move through the lines and out through the rotating heads she'd set along the ridge, spreading out across ground that had been gray and cracked for as long as she could remember. The smell of it, wet earth at high elevation in early summer, was something she hadn't expected to hit her the way it did. She stood there longer than she intended, not moving. Then she went to check on the flock. The flock had grown. In the winter, she'd kept a careful eye on the breeding stock, and the spring lambing had gone better than she'd forecast. Not without losses, she'd lost 4 lambs in March, and 1 difficult ewe in April, and there had been a stretch of 10 days in early March where she'd been running on 4 hours of sleep and a level of anxiety that had expressed itself physically as a persistent tightness across her shoulders that she'd carried for 3 weeks. But when the lambing season closed out in May, she had more animals than she'd started with, and the lamb crop was healthy, well-formed, with the tight fleeces of animals born into better nutrition than their mothers had come from. Pete Aldis drove down to see them in June. He was moving better than he had in November. His knees were being managed with new medication, he said, which he mentioned the way people mention medical improvements when they're grateful but not interested in dwelling on them. He walked through the flock slowly, checking animals the way he'd been checking animals for 40 years. hands and eyes doing the work of assessment without any apparent effort. Kale walked with him and said very little. At the end of the walkthrough, Pete stopped near the east pasture fence and looked at the irrigation heads running in the field beyond, the water catching the afternoon light in small arcs. The grass in there already visibly different from what she'd started with. Thicker, greener, standing up straight in a way that dry grass never does. "This is what he saw, isn't it?" Pete said. It wasn't quite a question. "My grandfather?" When he imagined what this place could be. Pete looked at the east pasture, then back at the flock. "He saw this." "I think he saw something like it," Kyle said. Pete nodded slowly. He had the look of a man who was feeling something he wasn't going to articulate, which was fine. Not everything needed articulating. "The lambs are good," he said finally. "They are. Better than good." He looked at a particular group of the younger animals. The ones born earliest in March, now 4 months old, and moving with the easy confidence of animals that had never had reason to be uncertain about their next meal. "The genetics are showing through now that they've got proper nutrition." He looked at her. "You've done right by them." "You built the foundation," she said. 30 years of breeding. "And then I was going to sell them to whoever would take them," he said, "because I was done and my sons are in Phoenix." He made a short sound. "You came along at the right time." "You could have sold them to a commodity operation," she said. "Gotten more money." "Could have," he agreed. "Didn't." He glanced at her sideways. "You were Edwin's granddaughter. That counted for something." She didn't say anything. "It should have counted for more when he was alive," Pete said. "That's the honest truth of it." He looked at the pasture again. "Anyway, they're good animals. I'm glad they ended up somewhere they're treated like it." The buyer started finding her in July. It began with a message through Renata's cooperative from a textile producer in the Northeast who had heard about the Rowan clip through the Craft Wool Network and wanted to discuss a standing supply agreement. Then a call from a small luxury goods company that was expanding into traceable, single-source wool products and was looking for producers who could document their land management practices. The full picture, pasture rotation, water management, animal welfare, the whole chain. Then an inquiry from a ranching publication that wanted to profile what was happening at the Rowan Ranch for their fall issue. Kale answered the textile producer and the luxury goods inquiry. She declined the publication profile politely, twice, before agreeing to a limited interview on the condition that it focused on land management practices rather than her personal story, which the writer agreed to and then spent half the interview trying to work around, which she navigated with the particular patience she'd developed over the past year for situations where the other person's agenda was visible but not worth confronting directly. The standing supply agreement with the Northeastern producer was the significant one. It wasn't just a one-time purchase. It was a multi-year commitment to a minimum volume at a fixed premium price, with quality benchmarks that Kyle was confident she could meet based on what the spring clip had shown and what the improved pasture nutrition was going to do for next year's fleece. She read the contract 3 times. She called a lawyer in the county seat, a practical, no-nonsense woman who handled agricultural contracts, and paid her to read it once more. "It's a real contract," the lawyer said. "The terms are fair. The escape clauses are standard. Anything I should push back on?" "The delivery window is tight for a single operation your size. I'd ask for an extension on the grace period." Kale asked for it. The producer agreed. She signed. When she told Vera, her grandmother looked at the contract copy Kyle put on the table in front of her. She read the numbers. She read them again. "This is per year," Vera said. "Yes." Vera set the paper down. She looked out the window for a moment. "Your grandfather," she said, and stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. "He would have had a great deal to say about this." "I know." "Mostly," Vera said, "he would have said I told you so." A pause. "He was not always gracious about being right." Kael laughed. A real one, short and sudden, the kind that comes out before you plan it. Vera looked at her with something that was almost a smile, the particular kind of almost smile she reserved for moments when she was pleased but considered displaying pleasure too straightforward to be interesting. "We should fix the north fence," Vera said, returning her eyes to the window, "if we're expanding the operation." "I've got lumber ordered," Kael said, "and the barn roof." Next month. Vera nodded. Good. She picked up her tea. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was complete. The valley shifted around her that summer, not all at once, and not without friction, but unmistakably. The assessed value of the Rowan property had moved through the local real estate and agricultural community like a stone dropped into standing water. The ripples from it spread in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes weren't, but they were constant and they changed the surface of things. The most visible change was in Tom Vassy. He'd been quiet since May. No drop-in visits, no sideways comments at the co-op, none of the casually delivered skepticism that had been his particular form of engagement since she arrived. She'd registered his absence the way you register a sound that stops, not immediately, but after a while, as a kind of negative space. He came by in late July. It was a Sunday, mid-morning, and he called first, which was new. She met him at the gate. He looked different, not dramatically. He was the same lean, weathered man he'd always been, the same way of moving, the same careful economy of expression. But there was something altered in the way he was carrying himself, a slight decrease in the settled certainty she'd always read in his posture. The aquifer assessment's been public for 2 months, he said, after they'd exchanged the basic greeting. He was looking at the east pasture, where the irrigation was running. I've had the county geological office pull the formation maps. All right, she said. The formation runs northeast from your property line. He paused. Beneath about 60 acres of the double V. She'd known this was likely. Patricia Wen's report had mentioned the formation's probable extent without being specific about what lay beyond the Rowan boundary. Carl mentioned it might extend further, she said carefully. It does. Vassy looked at her. I had my own assessment done in June. Didn't want to mention it until I had the results. He took his hat off, the same gesture she'd seen once before. In November, the gesture she'd registered as unusual. There's a secondary access point on my east boundary. Smaller yield than yours, but real. Vassy, I've been running cattle in this valley for 22 years, he said. My family before that for another 30. We know this land, we've always known this land. He paused. He was a man who did not apologize fluently. She could see that. It wasn't his natural language, and the effort of what he was doing showed in the deliberateness of his speech. I told you there was nothing under there. I told you Edwin was... that his ideas were impractical. He looked at the east pasture again. The irrigation heads were turning slowly in the morning light. I was wrong about that. She was quiet, letting it sit. I was wrong about the land, he said, and I was wrong about you. He looked at her directly. I thought you'd fold inside of 3 months. I thought the operation would fail and the property would come on the market. A pause. I was one of the interested parties, he said, when Griffith came to talk to you in October. She had suspected it in the back of her mind, but hadn't confirmed it. I figured it might be something like that, she said. The offer would have been fair, he said. At the time. Based on what anyone knew at the time. I know that. It would have been about 1/10 of what the property is worth now. He said it flatly, not as a confession, just as an arithmetic fact. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass. Above them, a hawk was working the thermal off the ridgeline, turning slow, patient circles. I'm not here looking for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not coming to you with my hat in my hand because I need something from you or because there's some advantage I'm looking for. He looked at her. I came because you've been doing this for 11 months, and you've done it right, and the least I can do is say so out loud instead of just knowing it privately. Kael looked at him. She had imagined this moment in an abstract way over the past months, the moment when the people who doubted her had to reckon with being wrong. She'd imagined it would feel like something. Satisfaction, maybe. Or some version of vindication. It didn't feel like that. It just felt like a man standing in front of her saying something true that cost him something, and her standing there receiving it. The sheep were the right call, Vassy said. The rotation was the right call. Drilling the east section was the right call. He put his hat back on. Everything I told you was wrong, and you knew it was wrong, and you did it anyway. He paused. That takes something. My grandfather already did the hard part, she said. I just followed the map he left. No, Vassie said. You trusted the map when nobody else would. That's not the same thing as following it. He looked out over the property one more time, the full sweep of it, the pastures greening up, the flock visible in the south section, the irrigation running in the east, the old house standing with a new coat of paint on the south wall where she'd found time in June to finally address it. He took it all in, and she watched him take it in, and she could see the assessment happening in real time. The recalibration of a man who had been wrong about something he was confident about and was integrating that fact honestly. I'll let you get back to it, he said. He started toward his truck. Vassie. He stopped and looked back. The secondary access point on your east boundary, she said. If you're thinking about developing it, Carl Harmon knows this geology now better than anyone in the county. He's worth calling. Vassie looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, that she'd offered it. All right, he said. I'll call him. He drove out. Kyle stood at the gate for a while after his truck disappeared down the county road, not doing anything in particular. Then she went back to work. The fall brought the second lamb crop assessment and the planning for the winter breeding program, which was a different kind of work than the crisis management of the first winter. More deliberate, longer view, the kind of planning that was only possible because she was no longer just trying to survive the next month. She spent 3 evenings in September working through the breeding records with Pete Aldis on the phone, selecting which rams to use on which ewes, planning for the fiber characteristics she wanted in next spring's lamb crop, making the kind of incremental decisions that don't show results for a year, but that compound over time into the kind of flock quality that took other operations decades to build. The luxury goods company came out in September to do their supply chain assessment, a process that involved 2 people with clipboards walking around the property for 2 days, photographing the pasture management, the water system, the shearing setup, the animal records, the land condition documentation she'd kept since the beginning. She walked with them and answered questions and showed them Edwin's journal when they asked about the water management history, which produced a silence from both of them that she didn't try to fill. At the end of the second day, the lead assessor, a careful, methodical woman named Diane, who had done these assessments for a decade and had the practice neutrality of someone who'd learned not to let enthusiasm compromise her evaluation process, sat down with Kyle in the kitchen and told her plainly that the Rowan operation met every standard on their list and exceeded several of them. The land management documentation going back to your grandfather's records, Diane said, is genuinely rare. Most operations can show you what they've done in the last 5 years. You can show a 30-year observational history of this specific land. That's exactly what this market wants. My grandfather did the 30 years, Kyle said. I've done 11 months. The 11 months are built on the 30 years, Diane said. That's the point. It's a continuous practice, not a marketing story. Kale signed their supply agreement in October, which layered on top of the Northeastern textile producer's contract in a way that, when she did the math, produced numbers she had to write down and look at for a while before they felt real. Not vast numbers. She was not becoming wealthy in any sudden or dramatic sense. She was becoming stable, which was the thing she had needed and had not allowed herself to want too specifically, because wanting specific things in specific quantities was a way of being hurt by the distance between what you wanted and what you had. Stable felt better than she'd expected. Dale Cutler came out in October with a bottle of whiskey he'd been holding on to for several years, waiting for an occasion. He did not announce this. He just appeared on a Sunday afternoon with it under his arm, and Kyle looked at it and looked at him and said, "I'll get glasses." And they sat on the porch steps in the October cold and had 2 drinks each while the flock moved through the west pasture in the late afternoon light. "I owe you an apology," Dale said after the first drink. "You don't." "I do. Not because you needed my support or my validation, but because your grandfather came to me years ago with that journal and I didn't take it seriously." He turned his glass in his hands. "I liked Edwin. I respected him. But I thought the water thing was a fixation, something he'd convinced himself of." He looked at the pastures. "I should have listened closer." "He didn't need you to believe him," Kyle said. "He just needed someone to drill a hole in the right place." "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. His evidence was good. It just needed the right person to act on it. She looked at the west pasture. The flock was settled and calm in the late light, their fall coats full and even, the kind of healthy flock that was visible as healthy even to someone who didn't know much about sheep. "That turned out to be me," she said. "I don't think he would have minded." Dale poured the second drink. They sat in the quiet of the October afternoon, and after a while he said, "Your grandmother's looking better." "The new medication is working better, and she's eating." Kael paused. "She helps with the flock records now, mornings. She says it gives her something to do, but I think she just likes being part of it." "She's a tough woman, Vera." "She is." Edwin used to say— Dale stopped and smiled a small smile that had some grief in it. He used to say she was the only person in the valley who was harder to convince than the land itself. He meant it as a compliment. Kael thought about her grandmother at the eastern section in May, gripping her arm briefly at the elbow, the specific restraint of that gesture. "She is hard to convince," she said, "but when she comes around completely." Dale nodded. He finished his drink. He stood up from the porch step with the careful movement of a man past 60 whose knees were registering the cold. "You've done something real here," he said. "I want you to know I see that." "Thank you, Dale." "And," he said, looking at her with the particular directness of a man who had thought about what he wanted to say, "I want you to know that the people who wrote this land off, who wrote your grandfather off, they weren't bad people. They were working with what they could see. Sometimes what you can see isn't everything that's there." "I know that," she said. "I know you know it," he said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." He walked to his truck, paused with his hand on the door. Edwin would be— he would have— he stopped, shook his head. "He'd have had a great deal to say." "Yeah," Kael said. "He would have." Dale drove out, and she sat on the porch step alone with the last of the light fading and the flock moving below, and the sound of the irrigation system ticking quietly as it completed its evening cycle, the mechanical sound of water being delivered to land that had been thirsty for a very long time. The ranching publication ran the profile in November. She hadn't expected much from it: a small readership, a regional audience, the kind of agricultural trade piece that circulated among people already in the industry. What she hadn't accounted for was the internet, which had a way of taking things that were written for a specific audience and handing them to a much larger one when something in them happened to resonate. The profile ran on a Thursday. By Sunday, the publication's website had registered 40 times its usual traffic on the piece. By the following Wednesday, Kael had emails forwarded from the publication from people across 4 states: ranchers, farmers, soil scientists, people with land they'd written off, people whose parents or grandparents had believed something about their land that nobody had taken seriously. She read every one of them. She didn't have time to respond to most of them, but she read them. One was from a soil scientist at a university 3 states east who had done his doctoral work on subsurface water identification through surface botanical indicators, the presence of certain deep-rooted plant species as evidence of deeper water access, and who wrote that Edwin Rowan's methodology, as described in the profile, was essentially the field approach his own research group had been developing in an academic context, without knowing that a rancher in the Sable Creek Valley had arrived at the same conclusions 40 years earlier through observation alone. She printed that one and put it in the journal, between the pages where her grandfather had written about the desert willows. She thought he would have appreciated knowing it, not as vindication. He hadn't needed vindication, she'd come to understand. He'd been certain. He'd just been alone in his certainty, which was a different problem, not a problem of evidence or logic, a problem of who was in the room when you were talking. She took the journal back to the shelf and stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the house settle around her in the November cold, the particular sounds of an old structure that had been through decades of hard winters and was still standing. Vera moving in the back room, the flock outside, quiet in the night pasture. The water system silent now, resting until morning. 11 months ago, she had stood in this kitchen, eating cold eggs off a plate her grandmother had left on the stove, too tired to sit down, staring out at a dark pasture full of animals she'd bought with almost everything she had. She was still tired. The work didn't stop being hard because the circumstances improved. The fence still broke. The weather still came in sideways. There were still mornings when something went wrong before she'd had her coffee, and she stood in the middle of it, cold and mud-covered, trying to figure out the least bad solution. But the fear had changed. The particular fear of those first months, the hollow, sleepless fear of someone who has committed completely to something they cannot control and can only wait to see if they were right. That fear was gone. What had replaced it was something she didn't have a clean word for. Not confidence, exactly. More like the steady, functional trust of someone who has learned to read the land she is standing on and has been proved right enough times to know that attention, real attention, is worth something. Her grandfather had known that. He'd known it for 30 years. Alone. She wasn't alone. She turned off the kitchen light and went to check on the flock one last time before bed, the way she did every night, the way she would do tomorrow night, and the night after that, for as long as the land needed her to. The second winter on the Rowan Ranch was nothing like the first. That was the thing Kael noticed most. Not the improvements in infrastructure, not the working irrigation system or the repaired barn roof, or the new fence line along the north boundary that no longer required emergency attention every time the wind picked up. Those were real, and she was grateful for them. But what struck her most deeply in the quiet of early December when the cold came back down off the Crestfall peaks, and the flock moved into their winter routine with the settled ease of animals that had learned to trust their ground, was the absence of a particular kind of fear. The first winter had been survival conducted at the edge of what she could hold together. Every morning had carried the weight of the possibility of failure. Not abstract failure, but the specific concrete failure of running out of money, of losing animals, of having to call Pete Aldis and tell him she'd destroyed what he'd spent 30 years building, of proving every skeptic in the valley right simultaneously. That fear had been useful, in the way that fear is useful when it keeps you honest and moving, but it had also been exhausting in a way she hadn't fully understood until it was gone. What she had now was different. Not ease. The work was still hard, and the ranch still had the particular personality of old land that expressed its needs loudly and without scheduling consideration. The north water line froze in the second week of December and took 2 days to sort out. A Yui came down with a respiratory infection in January and spread it to 6 others before Kael caught it, which meant a week of twice-daily treatments and careful quarantine management that disrupted the whole flock's routine. The truck's transmission finally gave out on the county road in February, leaving her stranded in 12-degree weather for 2 hours until Dale Cutler happened past and gave her a tow, during which she sat in his warm cab and felt the particular humiliation of needing help while simultaneously being grateful for it. But underneath all of it, under the frozen pipes and the sick sheep and the dead transmission, was something solid. The land was producing. The contracts were real. The aquifer was running, and perhaps most importantly, she understood the property now in a way that had taken a full cycle of seasons to build. The way it behaved in the cold, the way it came back in the spring, where it was strong and where it was still fragile, and what it needed from her in each of its moods. She knew her land. That knowledge was not romantic. It was practical and specific and had been earned through attention rather than sentiment. But it was real, and it was hers, and nothing the winter could throw at it felt like it had the power to take it from her. Tom Vassy called in January. She was in the barn when her phone rang, doing the afternoon check on 3 lambs she'd pulled inside for the cold, and she answered without looking at the screen. "It's Vassy," he said. "I know." She'd recognized the number by then. "I wanted to let you know, Carl Harmon finished the secondary well installation on my east boundary last week. How's the yield?" "Smaller than yours, but real." A pause. "Enough to change the summer water situation on the east pastures." Another pause, longer. "I've been running those acres dry every August for the past 6 years." "I know," she said. "I could see it from the ridge." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said, "about doing a winter grazing rotation on the east acres, resting them properly through the dry season instead of running cattle on them until they're stripped." He said it carefully, like a man offering something he'd been holding back. "I've been reading about it. The research." She recognized the particular quality of that sentence, the slight awkwardness of a man who had spent decades trusting tradition over documentation and was now quietly changing that. "The soil recovery timelines are pretty well documented," she said, keeping her voice neutral. There's good material from the State Agricultural Extension if you want a starting point. I'd appreciate that. I'll send it over. A brief pause. I also wanted to say, he stopped, started again. The way things went between us this past year. The things I said when you first came back. Vasi? Let me finish. He cleared his throat. I came at you sideways from the beginning. I had an agenda, the interested parties business, and I dressed it up as neighborly concern, and that wasn't right. He was choosing his words carefully, the way someone does when they've been thinking about something for months and have finally decided to say it. You were 24 years old coming back to a hard piece of land that nobody believed in, and instead of offering you any actual help, I told you repeatedly that you were making a mistake. I was wrong about the land, and I was wrong in how I treated you, and those are two separate things. She stood in the barn with 3 lambs moving around her feet, listening. I hear you, she said. That's all I'm saying, he said. I'm not asking for anything. I know you're not. She thought about how to say the next part. For what it's worth, the pushback was useful. Not because you were right, but because every time someone told me I was wrong, I went back to the journal and back to the land and made sure I could defend what I was doing. She paused. I don't need people to have believed in me from the beginning. I just need them to be honest now. Well, he said, that I can manage. I know, she said. Send Carl's invoice for the secondary well to my email. I want to see what he charged you. Make sure you didn't get a worse rate than I did. A silence. Then, from Vasi, something she hadn't heard from him before. A short, genuine laugh. Brief. Surprised out of him. I'll do that, he said. He hung up. She stood in the barn for a moment with the phone in her hand and the lambs crowding her boots for warmth, and she thought about what forgiveness actually was when you stripped it of the sentiment people dressed it in. It wasn't a feeling, she'd decided. It wasn't something that washed over you and changed everything at once. It was more like a choice made repeatedly, in small moments, to treat a situation as what it currently was rather than what it used to be. Vasi had been wrong. He'd said so. He was trying to be different. That was enough. That was honestly more than most people managed. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to the lambs. March came in cold and left warm, the way March in the high desert sometimes does when it changes its mind partway through, and with the warmth came the lambing season. The second one. The first she'd planned from the beginning rather than managed in the middle of a crisis. She had 37 ewes in the breeding program this year, selected in September with Pete Aldis on the phone, chosen for a combination of wool quality and maternal behavior and general hardiness in the specific conditions of the Rowan Ranch. The lambing happened over 3 weeks, which was 3 weeks of broken sleep and cold mornings, and the particular focused vigilance that livestock birth requires. But it happened cleanly, cleaner than the first year, because she knew what she was watching for, and because the animals were in better condition, and because the barn had been properly weatherproofed in November, which made the whole operation less about survival and more about management. She lost 2 lambs. One was a difficult presentation she couldn't turn in time, and one was a small single born to a young ewe who didn't produce enough milk, and who Kyle spent 3 nights supplementing before accepting that the lamb systems were just not strong enough. She buried that one the same place she'd buried the ram lamb in October of the first year, along the fence line in the south field, and stood there for a moment in the March mud feeling the particular quiet grief of someone who has learned that loss is not a failure of effort or attention, but sometimes just the shape of the thing. She'd learned that from the land. The land lost things too, trees to drought, grass to overgrazing, topsoil to erosion, and it didn't fail because of those losses. It incorporated them and kept going, which was not the same as not caring. It was something more complicated than caring. 35 lambs, healthy, well-formed, their fleeces already showing the quality of the improved breeding program. She walked through them on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of March, the mud sucking at her boots, the early spring light thin and clear above the Crestfall peaks, and she allowed herself the small, private satisfaction of knowing she'd built this from almost nothing. Pete Aldis drove down the following weekend. He parked outside the gate and walked through the flock without rushing. the same methodical way he always walked through animals. And Kyle walked with him without talking because she'd learned that this particular activity of his was not a social event. He was reading the animals. It took the time it took. At the end of the walk, he sat on the fence rail and looked at the lambs in the east pasture, where the irrigation was putting up the first of the spring grass. 35, he said. 35. From 37 ewes. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. That's a good rate for this elevation, for a second-year operation. He watched the lambs. The fleece on the February borns is already better than what I was getting in year 5. The nutrition's better, she said. The water made the difference in the pasture quality. The water helped, he said, but nutrition doesn't explain all of it. The selection choices were right. He looked at her sideways. You've got a feel for it. I had good records to start from. Records are records, he said. Reading them right is something different. He turned back to the lambs. I've been thinking about something, he said. Don't answer right away. Just hear it. She nodded. I've got the breeding records from the entire 30 years. Every animal I ever ran, back to the foundation stock. Fiber data, lamb records, health records, everything. He paused. They're in binders in my barn. My sons aren't interested in them. When I'm gone, they'll get thrown out or donated to someone who won't know what to do with them. She said nothing, waiting. I'd like to give them to you, he said. Officially, as a formal archive, with the condition that you use them, not just keep them, but use them in the breeding program, continue the line. He looked at her. What you've built here with those animals is the continuation of what I started. I'd like to know it's going somewhere. She held the silence for a moment. There was something in the offer that was larger than the practical value of 30 years of records, and she understood what it was. It was Pete Aldis handing her the thread of something he'd spent his life weaving and trusting her to keep weaving it. That was not a small thing. She did not treat it like a small thing. I'd be honored, she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled. Good. He got down from the fence rail. I'll box them up properly, label everything. He paused, and she could see him thinking about the right way to say the next part. Your grandfather, he said, used to say that the hardest thing about good work is that most of it happens in private, in places nobody ever sees, and you have to be all right with that. He looked at her. I think about that sometimes, whether I was all right with it. Were you? She asked. He considered it honestly. Mostly, he said. There were years I wasn't. Years when the market was bad and the buyers didn't care about quality, and I wondered if any of it mattered. He was quiet for a moment. But it mattered to the animals, and it mattered to you, as it turned out. Even before you knew it. He looked at the flock. I think that's enough. She drove him back to his truck and watched him pull out onto the county road, and she thought about what he'd said, about good work happening in private, in places nobody sees. Edwin Rowan had done his best work in private, in field notebooks, in letters nobody answered, in 30 years of morning walks across land that everybody else had written off. And here it was, still here, still producing, because one person had read what he wrote and decided it was worth acting on. The Sable Creek Valley Land Management Forum was not Kyle's idea. It was Dale Cutler's originally, and it was not a grand concept. It was Dale's practical response to a practical problem. The aquifer discovery had generated a significant amount of renewed interest in the valley's geological profile, and several ranchers, including Vassy and 3 others, were now in various stages of groundwater assessment on their own properties. At the same time, the profile piece had generated inquiries from producers outside the valley interested in the rotational grazing documentation she'd shared through the Ranching Publications online forum. You could do a meeting, Dale had said, in February in the feed store. Just a meeting. People who are interested in what you've been doing with the pasture rotation. Share the documentation. I'm not a researcher, she said. No, you're someone who's been doing it on this specific landscape for a year and a half and has documented it carefully. He shrugged. That's actually more useful to most ranchers than a research paper. She thought about it. She thought about Edwin Rowan writing 4 letters to a university that was polite and uninterested. She thought about what it had cost him to hold his knowledge in private for 30 years, and what it had cost the valley to go 30 years without that knowledge. Fine, she said. A meeting? small, at the ranch. It happened in April, on a Saturday, with 15 people. Dale, Vassie, 3 other ranchers from the valley, a county extension agent named Rosario who'd heard about it and asked to come. Patricia Wen drove up from the university. 2 ranchers from 2 counties over who'd read the profile. Pete Aldis, who had driven down and who spent most of the meeting listening with the alert stillness of someone storing everything they heard. Kale presented her documentation at the kitchen table. The pasture rotation records, the soil recovery data she'd been tracking, the wool quality progression over the 3 shearing seasons, the water management approach. She talked for about 40 minutes and then asked for questions. And what happened next was 3 hours of the most useful conversation she'd had since coming back to the ranch. Not because everyone agreed with her, but because the room contained enough different kinds of knowledge and enough people who were genuinely trying to solve real problems that the disagreements were productive rather than defensive. Vassie asked 3 specific questions about the rotation timing relative to seasonal precipitation, and they were good questions, the kind that came from someone who had been paying close attention to their own land for 20 years. She answered 2 of them directly and said she didn't have a good answer for the 3rd yet, which was the truth. Patricia Wen talked about the hydrogeological implications of coordinated water management across multiple adjacent properties. The idea that if several ranchers in the valley were working with the same underlying aquifer system, their extraction and management choices affected each other, and that some degree of coordination would benefit everyone. It was not a popular idea initially. There was resistance in the room, the deep, reflexive resistance of independent people to the idea of their decisions being anyone else's business. The resistance softened somewhat when Patricia explained it in terms of everyone's water lasting longer if they managed it together rather than in isolation. My grandfather tried to share this information, Kyle said, at one point when the room was processing the coordination question. He wrote to the university. He talked to people in the valley. Nobody wanted to hear it. She looked around the room. I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm saying it because the reason this meeting is happening is that he did the work, and someone finally paid attention to it. She paused. Whatever comes out of this room, the documentation, the water management coordination, any of it, it started with one rancher spending 30 years watching his land and writing down what he saw. She looked at Pete briefly, and with a man who bred a flock so carefully that the genetics survived long enough to end up here. The room was quiet for a moment. What do you want to happen with all of this? Rosario, the county extension agent, asked. She had a practical, direct way of speaking. You've built something here. You've got documentation. You've got results. What's the vision? Kyle had thought about this. She'd thought about it more than she'd told anyone. I want the documentation to be available, she said. The pasture records, the soil recovery data, the water management protocols, all of it, available to other ranchers in this landscape who want to use it. Not as a finished system, as a starting point. She paused. My grandfather's journal is the most useful piece of ranching knowledge I've ever encountered, and it sat in a cedar chest for 8 years because there was no mechanism for it to be anything else. She looked around the room. I don't want that to happen again. The forum ended without any formal resolutions or structures, which was probably the right outcome for a first meeting. But before people left, Rosario had exchanged phone numbers with Patricia Wen, and Dale had agreed to talk to the county extension office about hosting a follow-up. And Vassie, quietly, as people were moving toward the door, had asked Kyle if she'd be willing to walk his east pasture with him sometime and look at what the new water access was doing to his soil recovery. Sure, she said. Next week if you want. Next week, he said. And that was that. Vera's 76th birthday was in May. Kyle had been planning it for 2 months, which for her constituted elaborate preparation. She called Pete, she called Dale, she called Dr. Chen, she called a woman from the valley named Ruth, who had been Vera's closest friend for 40 years, and who lived 20 miles east and didn't drive much anymore. She coordinated rides. She made the pot roast that Vera had made every Sunday of her childhood, which required calling Vera's sister in Colorado for the recipe and then practicing it twice to get the seasoning right, which it still wasn't, quite, but was close enough. 12 people in the kitchen and the front room of the old house on a Saturday afternoon in May. The windows open to the spring air, the flock visible in the east pasture beyond, the irrigation running a slow, regular arc across the green. Vera sat at the head of the table and received it all with the composed dignity of someone who was moved but had no intention of showing it in any way that could be commented on. She talked to Ruth for 2 hours straight. She let Dr. Chen check her blood pressure without complaining. She accepted a glass of wine from Dale with the graciousness of someone who had been waiting for someone to offer her wine for months. At some point in the afternoon, when the conversation had spread through the rooms and Kael was standing in the kitchen cleaning up without any particular urgency, Vera came in and stood next to her at the counter. "This was your doing," Vera said. "Dale helped." "This was your doing," Vera repeated in the tone that meant the subject was settled. Kael dried her hands on the dish towel and looked out the window over the sink, the same window she'd stood at 11 months after arriving, too tired to sit, eating cold eggs off a plate her grandmother had left on the stove. The east pasture was green in a way it had never been when she was young, the irrigation giving it a depth of color that the dry years had never allowed. "I like it here now," she said. It came out simpler than she'd intended. Not a declaration, just a fact. Vera was quiet beside her for a moment. "Your grandfather liked it from the beginning," she said. "Even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard, maybe." She looked out the window, too. "I took longer. I was angry at this land for a long time. For what it cost us. What it cost him." She paused. "I came around eventually." "I know," Kael said. "He would have liked you," Vera said. "Not as a comfort, as a plain, considered assessment. He would have liked the way you went about it. Quiet, patient, not needing people to see it." "I needed it sometimes," Kael said. "More than I let on." Vera looked at her. "I know that too," she said, and there was something in her voice, something that had softened without becoming sentimental, the way old things sometimes soften when they finally decided to. That made Kael understand her grandmother had known it all along and had chosen not to say so, because saying it would have been a kindness in the moment but a disservice over time. Vera had offered her the hardest version of support, the kind that trusts a person to find their own footing without the comfort of being carried. It had been the right call. Kael had needed the hardness more than the softness. "Thank you," she said, "for not making it easier." Vera made a short sound that was almost a laugh. "It wasn't exactly voluntary," she said. "I didn't have much to give." "You gave the journal." A silence. "He kept it in that chest for 40 years, Vera said. "I read it once after he died. Then I put it back." She turned her cup in her hands. "I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't think anyone would." She looked at Kael. "You knew what to do with it." Otz. The second spring shearing happened in late May, and Marcus came back with his rig and the same efficient silence and made the same kind of comment at the end, shorter this time, because the quality of the clip spoke for itself, and Marcus was not a man who repeated what was already obvious. The clip went to 4 buyers. The Northeastern textile producer, Renata's Cooperative, the luxury goods company, and a new connection. A small American wool revival project that was documenting and promoting domestically sourced fine wool as an alternative to imported fiber. They'd found her through the ranching publication profile and through the forum write-up that Rosario had included in the County Extension newsletter. When the season's numbers were totaled in June, Kael sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at them. She had cleared the remaining debt to Pete Aldis. She had a fully operational irrigation system. She had a flock of nearly 400 healthy, quality animals. She had 3 standing supply contracts and a 4th in negotiation. She had a ranch that the county assessor had reevaluated at 8 times its value when she'd arrived. She was 25 years old. She thought about the 24-year-old who had driven a truck with a slow tire through a gap in a broken fence and sat in the cab for a long moment, hands on the wheel, looking at a house that sagged and a pasture the color of ash. That woman had been afraid in a way she'd never been before and hadn't entirely known how to name, not of failure specifically, but of the distance between what she'd decided to believe and what she could prove. The gap between her grandfather's certainty and the world's indifference. She understood something now that she hadn't understood then, that the gap hadn't been a problem. It had been the whole point. Anyone can act on certainty. The thing that mattered, the thing that separated what her grandfather had done from what everyone else in the valley had done, was the willingness to stay with something true before the world agreed it was true. To keep tending the knowledge even when nobody was watching, to trust what careful observation told you even when experience and tradition and the accumulated opinion of everyone around you said otherwise. That was the actual lesson. Not that persistence leads to reward or that underdogs win if they work hard enough. Those were the easy readings of what had happened here, and they were both too simple and too comfortable to be quite right. The actual lesson was harder and less tidy. Sometimes you're wrong, even when you're careful. Sometimes the well comes up dry. Sometimes the land doesn't come back. Sometimes you do everything right, and the outcome still isn't what you worked for. But the observation still matters. The careful attention still matters. The documentation still matters. Because even if Edwin Rowan's specific hypothesis had been wrong, even if the aquifer hadn't been there, the 30 years he'd spent watching this land had produced knowledge that would have been valuable regardless. And the willingness to take that knowledge seriously, to act on it when everyone else had made their peace with ignoring it, was the thing that made the difference. Not courage, exactly. More like a refusal to let what other people couldn't see define what was actually there. She put the numbers away and went outside. The flock was in the east pasture, moving through the summer grass in the slow, settled way of animals that have no reason to be anxious. The irrigation heads were running in a far corner of the field, the sound of them a constant background note she'd stopped consciously hearing months ago. The old house stood at the top of the slope with its new paint on the south wall and its leaking roof, still leaking slightly in one corner, which she hadn't gotten to yet and was on the list for fall. The journal was on the shelf inside. Pete Aldis's 30 years of records were in labeled binders in the back room, next to the filing system she'd built to house them. The pasture rotation logs were in the binder on the kitchen table, updated through the current week. The water management records were in the folder next to that. All of it was there. All of it was accessible. All of it could be given to someone else someday, if someday there was someone else who needed it. Another person returning to something everyone had given up on, looking for a starting point, looking for evidence that careful attention to hard land was worth something. She walked down the slope to the east pasture and stood at the fence, watching the flock. One of the older ewes, not the old girl, who had died peacefully in February, in the corner of the barn with Kyle sitting beside her in the cold, but a ewe she'd come to recognize by the particular way she moved through the group, deliberate and unhurried. A lead animal, in the understated way of animals who lead without performing it, looked up from the grass and looked at her directly for a moment, then went back to eating. Kyle stayed at the fence for a while. The afternoon was warm and the mountains were visible, and the water was running, and the grass was green over ground that had been gray and cracked and written off by everyone who'd ever looked at it without looking closely enough. She was not finished. The north fence still needed work. The barn roof still needed work. There were breeding decisions to make for fall, soil recovery data to compile and send to Rosario, a conversation with Patricia Wen about the water management coordination across the valley that she'd been putting off because it was going to be complicated and would involve people who were not easy to coordinate. None of it was finished. It was never going to be finished, in the sense that some people meant when they talked about finishing. Some clean arrival at a completed state where everything was resolved and no longer demanded anything. The land didn't work that way. The work didn't work that way. You didn't finish a ranch. You tended it indefinitely, season by season, year by year, making the best decisions you could with the knowledge you had, and improving the knowledge steadily so the next decisions were better. Her grandfather had understood that. He'd spent 30 years tending knowledge that he never got to use. And here she was, using it. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. She turned and walked back up the slope to the house, where Vera was inside and the kettle was probably on and the work of tomorrow was already organizing itself quietly at the edge of her thinking, the way the work always did when you'd been at something long enough to love it. Not easily, not without cost, but in the deep, complicated, clear-eyed way that survives all the seasons that try to break it. The Rowan Ranch, 412 acres, 1 aquifer, 391 sheep. One woman who had come back to a forgotten place and refused to see it the way everyone else did. And a journal in a cedar chest waiting 20 years for someone to read it right.